Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. If you hear any background noise, we've had a rousing game of The Floor is Lava going on around the McDowell house. I don't have the heart to tell them that convection would have cooked both of them within seconds. Anyhow, today we're looking at the effects of the Second World War, a continuation of what we did yesterday with the war itself. My target time for this one is 15 minutes because, as you know, I can get carried away. So let's roll forward. So World War I, as we said, brought a lot of women into the workforce, but just like so many other things in history, you really cannot compare it to World War II. The number of people who joined the labor force was such that for the only time, as far as I know, in its history, the U.S. unemployment rate was 0%. And a lot of those people were, of course, women. Women worked in the millions. In the Soviet Union, they were almost 100% of the farmers, as this propaganda poster with the very pretty lady on it says. And women also controlled a large portion of the Soviet industrial labor force. Now, it was big in other countries, but it was huge in the Soviet Union. And as an added interesting thing to a lot of people, at least 100,000 women saw actual combat in the Soviet Red Army. That's pretty unique to the Soviet Union. There's some scattered instances of like a single female soldier in some other armies, but in the Soviets, they had actual units, mainly fighter pilots, of women serving in frontline combat. Unfortunately, there are two sides to this coin, and unlike the First World War, women are much more frequently killed by the second one. Urban bombing raids would kill indiscriminately men, women, children. Bombs don't care who you are. That, of course, killed the majority of women killed during this war. But unfortunately, there was actually also the widespread use of rape as a tool of coercion, as a punishment, as a victory prize, whatever you want to call it. Rape is rape. Um, Done by armies of the Second World War. The Japanese perpetuated this crime in China, the Germans in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets during their counter invasion of Germany. That's not to say that sexual assault did not happen and was not performed by other armies in the war. Those are just the armies that perpetuated it in the largest numbers. More than one book I have read describes the Soviet capture of Berlin as the largest mass rape in history. And hundreds and thousands of Korean and Chinese women were also taken in by the Japanese and recruited, often at gunpoint, as comfort women, basically as army provided prostitutes for their troops. So that happened. Of course, the Second World War is also notable for its featuring the targeted destruction of entire groups of people, not just indiscriminate bombing of cities, but specific attempts to wipe out a population within, in Germany's case, Europe. They attempted to extinguish the Jews. They attempted to wipe out the Jewish people. That was the primary target of the Nazi Holocaust. However, with that, the Nazis did also attack Slavic peoples, that's Poles, Russians, any of the many groups in Yugoslavia, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, all sorts of people. Too many for me to list. The Roma people, also known as gypsies, that's a term that's falling out of favor because it's got some unfortunate connotations. So the Roma people of wanderers, handicapped, communists, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses. Um, all of those groups, and of course political dissidents and anybody who disagreed with them, um, all of those groups found themselves being detained, and in the later phases of the war, really ramping up in 1941, you start to see extermination plans made. 6 million Jews are killed in the Nazi death camps. Somewhere between 5 and 6 million people of other ethnic groups were targeted by Germans in the Holocaust. We will talk more about that in the final lesson of this unit, as well as in further examples of genocide and ethnic cleansing throughout Unit 8 and to a lesser extent Unit 9. The Holocaust had a lot of very far-ranging impacts. A lot of European Jews, you may remember from our lesson on the post-war tensions, a lot of European Jews began to migrate to what is now Israel, that land that was proposed as a homeland for the Jewish people. And Western nations, seeing the horror of the Holocaust, which, remember, was the end of a long chain of violence against the Jews. We talked about anti-Semitic violence quite literally on the second day of this class. So this is not just something out of the blue, it is just the most horrific and widespread example of violence against the Jewish people. Unfortunately, there was nowhere in a vacuum for these people to go to, and Arabs living in the region were pretty incensed for both religious reasons, Muslims and Jews for reasons that are quite complicated, have a very tumultuous history, and because a decent number of Arabs, again as an ethnicity regardless of what faith they practiced, were displaced by the creation of Israel. And that creates a conflict that is boiling up to this present day, and I'm sure if I allowed comments on these videos would produce a stimulating discussion. So, and by the way, what you're looking at over there is actually a plan called the two-state solution, which was supposed to have a Jewish state in green over there, an Arab state outlined in red over there, and Jerusalem as kind of an open city. Fairly obviously, that's not what went down. Okay, the Second World War, and we'll talk about this a lot more in Unit 8, produced a huge uptick in the number of communist nations. The Soviets, as they gobbled up Eastern Europe, as they took it back from the Nazis, did not declare those nations to be free. They mostly kept the borders that had been established at the end of the First World War, but in a lot of these nations, they established communist puppet governments, oftentimes from people who had had almost no political power prior to the wars. So the number of European communist nations went up, though it was hardly organic. In China, meanwhile, communist forces were much better at fighting the Japanese than nationalist forces, even though they tended to be smaller in number. There's a lot of reasons for that I don't really have the time to go into. But that increased communist resistance, the fact that communism promised, hey, we're going to restore order and make everybody equal to a nation that had been deeply divided and deeply unequal. Well, by 1949, a civil war that, again, talking about it in Unit 8, a civil war that had been going on for a long time was won by the communists in 1949. Here we have a guy we're going to see a lot of in Unit 8, Mao Zedong, and as well as a picture of him and a quote, one of my, I don't know if it's a favorite quote, but it is one of those quotes that I always circle and underline whenever I'm making notes, especially about Chairman Mao. And what you see here, of course, is a map of the communist world after World War II, the bits in Eastern Europe primarily given away at Potsdam and Yalta by the US and Britain to the Soviets, and of course China, North Vietnam, and North Korea. If you look over in Asia, East Asia and Southeast Asia, you can see those nations were also made communist. Again, we'll get into the guts of this more in Unit 8. For right now, you just need to know that, oh my gosh, communism much more widespread after the Second World War. World War II pretty much gutted what had been the political center of Europe. France had been conquered, Britain had been heavily bombed, Germany had been heavily bombed and was divided in two. And the result is a Europe that is pretty much carved up between two superpowered nations, and to a lesser but still very much noticeable extent, a world carved up between those two superpowers. The US, which was supposed to be the assistant of democracy, and which was, unless democracy didn't benefit us, and the Soviet Union, which was power to the people, except when the people wanted something that the Soviet Union didn't. Got to be flexible, right? The Soviets dominate these communist nations that they had forced at tank point to become communist, and of course the USA overshadows Western Europe, not because it forced any of them to become democracies or to stay democracies, but more so because those nations were shells of what they had been. So you wind up pretty much with only two big fish left in the pond. All right, outside of Europe, European power goes into decline, and you need to put a pin in this idea. This is a huge part of Unit 8. Just like World War I, colonial soldiers go home from Africa, India, Southeast Asia, etc., and they begin to say, hey, Europe, what makes you better than us? What makes you supreme to us? And more importantly, this war had been fought against aggressive imperialism, especially against Japan and Germany, but also Italy with that whole build a new Roman Empire thing. And you begin to see Britain and France, they really can't vindicate the existence of their empires. And between 1945 and 1960, most of Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia is going to gain its independence. So those movements that had kind of started, kind of been sputtering along before the war, before the First World War, got a shot in the arm by the First World War, now they are finally coming to fruition. Told you we'd get here. All right, and then there's the UN. The fact that there was a second huge global conflict between 1914 and 1945 had prompted this idea that maybe we can all just sit down and have a global, the idea was originally to have not necessarily a global government, but something resembling that, a whole lot more than what the UN actually became. The UN was fostered to encourage international cooperation, to help the people of all nations work together, etc., etc. Now, the UN definitely has not kept the peace and established a much more peaceful world. We will see that in a series of really depressing lessons over the course of the next couple of weeks. It's much more of a political forum where people can speak on issues that matter to them, even people from countries you haven't heard of. And it does represent a step in the right direction. I'm not saying the UN's perfect, guys. Look, if you ever really need to bum yourself out, you can look up UNAMIR, UNAMIR, the United Nations Aid Mission in Rwanda. It was a complete disaster. I was alive for it and vaguely remember pieces of it. And you also see the development of other international bodies. But again, the goal here is further international cooperation. And to the credit of the UN and other international peacekeeping efforts, as well as the policy of deterrence, we haven't seen anything near the size of conflict of the Second World War, and hopefully we never will. These other bodies are primarily, global financial institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. Their increased internationalism, whether or not they're good things or bad things, depends upon several of the people you ask. Strong arguments can be made for and against them. But it is worthy to remember that we live in a much more connected world now, for good and for ill. We're going to talk about that more in Unit 9, too. All right. Now, unlike the First World War, the Second World War ends with one last big shift in the geopolitical balance of power. The U.S., unlike World War I, where we deferred our role as a superpower, we turned that role down after the First World War. After World War II, we said, nope, we're here. Now, the reasons for this are way too complex and way too controversial for me to get into in a video where I said I was only going to keep you for 15 minutes, and I'm going to try to only miss that by a few seconds. But the U.S. involves itself very heavily in global politics after World War II. There is no return to isolation. There is no, oh well, let's take our ball and go home. Stalin, we trust you. That doesn't happen. And the post-war world, whether you like it or not, for good and for ill, whether it's our economy, whether it's our military, whether it's our culture, the post-war world has been largely defined by America's actions. We are only just now beginning to see in some areas places and people coming out and influencing people who are not American. America has been a hugely dominant cultural force really since the end of the Second World War. And again, whether or not that's positive or negative, in many cases has depended directly upon, are you a person for whom American political activity has been a net good or a net negative? And I'll be honest with you, most of us as Americans aren't really qualified to answer that question for anybody but our fellow Americans, and even then, not in all cases. So, we're getting into some touchy, controversial territory, but there's no one else I'd rather be doing it with. I will see you guys again tomorrow, where we have one final lesson. It sticks out like a sore thumb from this unit, but it is a doozy of a depressing lesson. It is post-World War II atrocities. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.